Welcome everyone to this, well, who knows what it's going to be actually, but anyway, we will wait and see. Thank you all for joining us for what is officially the third College of Asia and the Pacific Professorial Lecture for 2024. This lecture series honours and celebrates the outstanding achievements of our colleagues who've recently been promoted to professor. And it's an opportunity for us to find out what exactly it is they do all day, but also to get a sense of how what they do fits with the broader remit of the college and indeed the university. My name's Helen Sullivan. I'm the Dean of the College, and as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And also pay my respect to any First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work and may be with us this evening. So tonight we are here to celebrate and recognise Professor Luke Glanville's contributions to research and teaching at the college. Luke is based, all evidence suggesting otherwise, Luke is actually based in the International Relations Department of the Coral Bell School, and I know that George, the head of department, is here. His research interests include the history and future of protection against atrocities and questions of global rights and responsibilities. And Luke is the author of a number of incredibly well-regarded books, and I know that he has another one coming out later this year, or is it out already? Yeah, okay. Well, it's good that you're reasonably certain about when that's happening. You sure you wrote it? Maybe, yeah. Anyway, moving on. So Luke is particularly interested in refugee protection and questions surrounding colonial conquest and rule. And his lecture this evening will examine how enslaved blacks and their descendants in the United States expressed the dissonance through slave songs, the blues, and jazz. His lecture today is complemented by a musical performance with Wayne Kelly on the piano. Wayne, welcome. James Luke on double bass. James, welcome. You are honorary professors for the evening. And Luke on the drums himself. I have no idea whether that's a good thing or not. But anyway, it is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Luke Glanville to the lectern.
Thanks, Helen. I too want to begin by acknowledging Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Over the years, I have occasionally expressed loving concern to colleagues, and I do mean loving concern, that they're trying to do too many things with a particular talk or a piece of writing. They have one really good idea that's more than enough to go on with, and they've risked undermining the force of that idea by supplementing it with or framing it in terms of an additional idea that takes everything in a slightly different direction. I've suggested, borrowing some words from others, it's a bit like putting a hat on a hat. Tonight I'm going to put several hats on hats. I'm rather excited to do so. I invite you to focus on whichever hats take your fancy. But I hope you might try to see why I thought it could be useful to try out all these hats at the same time. I fear, though, that henceforth I'll never again be able to credibly accuse colleagues of putting a hat on a hat, and I'm a bit sad about that. Western states, including Australia, put a lot of money and time and effort into keeping refugees at a distance. Like the United States, and Britain and EU member states, Australia works hard to contain refugees elsewhere in the global south, typically in poorer, more insecure parts of the world. It works hard to deter them from making their way towards us to claim asylum, and it detains, for long periods of time, those who do manage to make it here, so as to deter others from trying to do the same. When justifying their policies of refugee exclusion, states like Australia commonly appeal to their own concerns and needs. They invoke the importance of prioritising the economic and security and cultural interests of their own people Sometimes they cast refugees as threatening, blameworthy, or otherwise undesirable in order to justify their exclusion. But at other times, when seeking to persuade perhaps more sensitive, compassionate listeners of the morality of their policies, they argue that their policies of refugee exclusion are in place for the benefit of the refugees themselves. So policies aimed at deterring refugees from travelling to claim asylum, for example, are said to protect refugees from nefarious people smugglers and deaths on dangerous journeys across land and sea. These humane-sounding justifications can be difficult to grapple with. When we hear them, I think some of us feel a sense of unease. There's something intuitively troubling about denying welcome to vulnerable people. But we're told it's the most compassionate thing that can be done for them and for others like them. And how can you argue against compassion? How can you argue against policies that seek to discourage asylum seekers from putting themselves in the hands of people smugglers and undertaking dangerous journeys that risk their lives and those of their children? Appeals to humane justifications work in part because they appear to offer a plausible response to a real and pressing issue, the vulnerability of displaced people. They also work because appeals to what is humane seem to close off avenues for political and ethical contestation. So tonight I want to try to reopen these avenues by exploring the dissonance inherent in these humane-sounding arguments. One way of getting at this dissonance and beginning to wrestle with it, I suggest, is to turn to history. Today's humane justifications for refugee exclusion echo arguments that imperial metropoles, settler colonies, and sovereign states have long advanced to justify controlling the mobility of vulnerable populations. I'm in the early stages of writing a book that examines this long history of what I call humane domination. That is, the humane justifications that powerful actors have long used to justify the forced removal of Indigenous peoples, the forced transfer of ethnic minorities, the trafficking and coerced labour of slaves, constraints on the mobility of freed slaves, and the ways that these arguments, which were developed in contexts of colonialism and slavery, resonate with the supposedly humane arguments that are used today to justify the exclusion of refugees. And I should say at this point, I'm immensely grateful to my colleagues here in the Department of International Relations who've spent and given me countless hours of their friendship in helping me develop over several years now the ideas that I plan to work with in the book. So what are some examples of humane domination that I'll be exploring? So, when states today say that they must deter asylum seekers from using people smugglers and undertaking dangerous journeys for their own safety, they are repeating tried and tested tropes of humane domination. So think of the continuities between this reasoning and the justifications that were offered for forced removals of Indigenous peoples in 19th century settler colonial authorities in the United States, Canadian provinces, Australian colonies all used these justifications. The removals of these populations from their lands were justified as necessary for their protection from unruly settlers, as well as from their own uncivilised selves, and their own miscomprehension of what was best for themselves. When international actors encourage us to think of refugees as resilient people with agency and capacity for flourishing, rather than passive victims needing our help, they are purportedly upholding and celebrating refugees' humanity, but they're also inadvertently normalising the displacement of refugees, unconsciously mirroring arguments about the resilience of certain people that were used to justify slavery in the United States, the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the 18th and 19th centuries. I'll return to this motif of resilience a bit later. When states and scholars express concern that granting refugees from the global south admission to culturally and economically different countries in the global north, when they express concern that that risks doing more harm than good to those refugees, they are echoing well-rehearsed arguments about how enslaved black people in the American South would suffer moral, physical, and psychological degradation if they were emancipated and allowed to move to the American North. I'll return a little to that motif a bit later as well. When states insist that refugees can be best cared for where they already are, in the global south, with their well-being and safety provided for in refugee camps, their arguments parallel justifications for past camps constructed for the containment of undesirable people, such as the famine camps established by British authorities in India in the late 19th century. Both past and present, the possibility of care requires acceptance of immobility and domination at the hands of all-powerful carers. When states propose replacing, or at least supplementing, humanitarian care of refugees with the provision of development assistance to underdeveloped states who are hosting refugees, once again they're reproducing development approaches used to justify the containment of undesirable people over the years. When political leaders and commentators suggest the establishment of new autonomous self-governing territories to which refugees can be removed, as they inevitably do every couple of years, their ideas echo the long history of such solutions to the plight of unwanted people, including the establishment of Liberia and Sierra Leone, to which freed slaves could be pressured to move or perhaps forcibly moved. And when people invoke the problem of the brain drain and express concern that young, skilled refugees should not be admitted into wealthy Western countries because they are needed by their communities back home, we feel resonances with arguments of people like Abraham Lincoln, who argued that free blacks ought to leave the United States and move to Liberia or Central America or elsewhere for the sake of their enslaved kin. The argument here being that the emigration of free blacks would speed up the process of emancipation because slave holders would be encouraged that if they liberated their slaves, they would leave the country. An understanding of this long history of humane domination helps us see that today's humane-sounding arguments about refugees are well-rehearsed tactics long deployed by powerful Western actors in contexts of colonialism and slavery and other relations of domination and subjugation. As I said, I'll go into some detail in a moment about the resilience and degradation motifs. But before I begin to explore that, I want to suggest that in addition to examining the dissonance of humane domination by looking at its disturbing history, we can also usefully feel this dissonance in the music created by some people who've been subjected to humane domination and their descendants. So people of African descent who were trafficked as slaves to the American colonies and later to the United States, or who were born into or kidnapped into slavery in America, felt the dissonance of humane domination in their bodies, and they expressed it with their bodies through music, through slave songs and spirituals. Over time, they and their descendants developed and transformed this music and expressed this dissonance anew through gospel music and through the blues and through jazz. Recognition of the dissonance of humane domination helps us to problematize and wrestle with it. And we can feel this dissonance in music, and this helps us to feel its reality. I want to invite up two of my favourite people, also two of Australia's finest jazz musicians, who I have the pleasure of playing with occasionally here in Canberra, Wayne Kelly and James Luke. Woo! Did I catch you deciding which instrument you're going to play briefly there? Yeah. So jazz is an African-American art form, and inherent to jazz is dissonance. Rhythmic dissonance can be created through the use of unresolved syncopation or polyrhythms, that is, multiple rhythms that are played at once and that refuse to resolve in ways that our ears might want them to. But perhaps dissonance can be more easily felt in melodic and harmonic terms. So here, dissonance and tension and a feeling of irresolution is created through the use of jarring or clashing intervals or chords. And so, in certain ways, jazz expresses dissonance and a yearning and a longing for resolution. Jazz illuminates the reality of dissonance, and I think it impels within the hearer a resistance to dissonance. Our ears feel the dissonance and hunger for its resolution. See if you can hear the dissonance that we express now in this tune called Evidence by Thelonious Monk. So let's look at one motif of humane domination, which was imposed upon enslaved people in the past and is being imposed upon displaced people today, the motif of resilience. How is it expressed today? How was it expressed in the past? And how might we understand these historical resonances? So today, UN agencies, international NGOs, states, some scholars, increasingly encourage us to think of refugees as resilient people possessing agency and capacity to flourish, rather than passive victims in need of international aid and assistance. Rather than vulnerable and needy victims, we're told that refugees are resilient, resourceful, adaptable, creative actors who are capable of not only surviving but thriving amidst their displacement. This discursive framing purports to uphold and celebrate the humanity and the dignity of refugees. UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, celebrates individual stories of Syrian refugees' resilience and determination, as these refugees are seen to thrive in host countries in the global south. Scholars too celebrate the resilience of refugees and propose ways to harness this resilience for the mutual benefit of refugees and their host countries. So Oxford professors Alexander Betts and Paul Collier speak of the extraordinary resilience of Syrians in the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, where they say one finds endless illustrations of the creativity and entrepreneurship of refugees. Rich and disturbing insights about such resilience talk can be generated by situating contemporary resilience talk in a longer history of powerful actors attributing resilience to vulnerable others. In this longer history, we find that this attribution of resilience is commonly marked by practices of domination that are grounded in processes of racialization and segregation and the denial of mobility, troubling marks of resilience talk that can still be observed today. So consider the deployment of the idea of resilience by white slaveholders and their supporters to justify the institution of slavery in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. Pro-slavery writers argued that people of African descent were naturally suited to slavery. Such arguments were borrowed from British and French and other slaveholders and intellectuals, and developed by various American figures such as founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, medical practitioners and race scientists like Samuel Cartwright and Josiah Nott. We can distinguish three forms that this argument took. The first was the philosophical claim, derived from Aristotle, that certain people, and perhaps even peoples, plural, are slaves by nature. The medical practitioner Samuel Cartwright was one who deployed Aristotle's terminology, describing Africans as natural slaves. He argued more generally that Africans, being naturally inclined to idleness and laziness, were not merely suited to, but in fact depended upon and flourished under the authority of white masters who forced them to engage in physical labour. Cartwright explained that not only did Africans have strong muscles and hardy frames and take pleasure in agricultural labour under the subjection of a white master, but they had an inbuilt inclination to moderate their exertions so that it was impossible for them to be overworked. In the mid-19th century, two British craniologists put it explicitly in terms of resilience, claiming that the sunburnt sons of Africa had long been exceptional in that they had a sufficiently pliant, docile, and yet resilient nature. And this meant that when subjected to slavery, they neither resisted it nor perished under it. Thomas Jefferson expressed it in terms of an emotional or psychological resilience. Their griefs are transient, he wrote. The second form of resilience talk, already hinted at with the phrase sunburnt sons of Africa, was climatological. it was claimed that African bodies were especially suited to and resilient to physical labour in warmer climates, such as in the American South. Cartwright again. The white man cannot endure toil under the burning sun of the cane and cotton field and live to enjoy the fruits of his labour. The African, impelled by the stronger will of the white man, is much happier during the hours of labour in the sunny fields than when dozing in his native woods and jungles. And the third form of resilience talk followed from this climatological claim. It was an epidemiological claim. Africans were said to be immune to certain diseases, such as malaria and yellow fever, that were widespread in the American South, and so they could survive being put to work there. Whites couldn't, the argument went. The echoes of these pro-slavery claims in today's resilience talk about refugees are worth hearing. Resilience then and now is demanded of vulnerable people by dominant others. Such attributions and demands for resilience serve to distract from and obscure the causes of individuals' vulnerability, whether it be their subjection to the institution of slavery or the institution of refugee exclusion. And just as little attention is given to the need to address the causes of vulnerability, little effort is also made to reduce this vulnerability, and little hope is provided that this state of vulnerability will at some point end. Attributions of resilience have the effect of placing responsibility for survival and flourishing on the individuals themselves, rather than on the institutions and actors holding them in a state of vulnerability. And thus, should they fail to survive and thrive, this is in some way their fault. This point was made clearly by pro-slavery theorists who insisted that since Africans were naturally suited to slavery, the suffering and death of certain slaves must be a product of their individual moral failings. And there are racial resonances to be felt here too. So it's no coincidence that the rise of resilience talk about refugees followed on the heels of the rise of what B.S. Chimney terms the myth of difference in the later decades of the 20th century, whereby white refugees were considered worthy of admission by states in the global north, but black and brown-skinned refugees needed to be contained elsewhere. So I don't recall hearing anyone demanding resilience from displaced Ukrainians as an alternative to their seeking asylum in Europe over the last few years. And yet the discourse of resilience with respect to people displaced and contained in Africa and the Middle East continues. The resonances in resilience talk don't end there, though. For both 21st century refugees and 19th century slaves, the attribution of resilience only extends so far. The reasoning goes that slaves and refugees are only so resilient that they can thrive under their present conditions of domination and immobility. Their liberation and freedom to move to the American North in the 19th century or the global North in the 21st century will lead to their degradation. So the Oxford professors Betts and Collier posit a variety of reasons why refugees from the global South will thrive in host countries in the global South, but not in the global North. The resilience of refugees and their capacities to take advantage of the opportunities provided by globalisation, they say, are best harnessed in the global South. Refugees will struggle to participate in the economies and societies of countries in the global North that have radically different cultures and labour needs, and they'll be more likely to suffer psychological ailments as a result. Similar claims were made in response to arguments for emancipation in the 19th century. Emancipated Africans, it was argued, would struggle to thrive or even survive in the absence of a master compelling them to use their labour and caring for their well-being. They will succumb to both mental and physical health ailments, struggle to find the motivation or opportunity to work, and ultimately turn to crime. And all of this especially if they're allowed to be mobile and move to the colder northern states to which they're not physically suited. Samuel Cartwright claimed that there was a disease peculiar to blacks that was called rascality. And it was suffered by nearly all freed blacks, he said, but not by enslaved blacks. This disease was, he said, the natural offspring of Negro liberty, and it manifests in lesions on the body and stupidness of the mind, leading to self-indulgence, mischief, and criminality. So that's just a small taste of one or two of many arguments involving one form or another of humane domination that have been applied to slaves and Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities in the past, and that are again being applied to refugees to justify their exclusion and control today. Let me say something about the painting you've been looking at. This painting is called The Banjo Lesson. As you can see, it depicts an old man tenderly teaching a young boy, perhaps his grandson, to play the banjo, passing on the musical techniques and traditions with which black people expressed their experiences in such profound ways. The artist responsible for the painting is Henry Ossawa Tanner. Tanner is known as the first African-American artist to achieve international success and fame. Tanner was born in 1859 in the United States, born to a free-born father who was a Methodist preacher, and a mother who we think was probably born into slavery in Virginia and then escaped via the Underground Railroad. Tanner's middle name, Ossawa, was short for Osawatomie, which is a town in Kansas where John Brown led a group of abolitionists in battle against pro-slavery forces in 1856, 3 years before famously leading the raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Tanner grew up in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, but spent most of his life in Paris. He painted The Banjo Lesson in 1893 during a brief return to the United States. The painting is quite radical for its time, for depicting the everyday life of black people and refusing the racial stereotypes widely used by white people of blacks as people whose role as musicians or otherwise was to entertain whites, or worse, stereotypes of blacks as people who are submissive, dangerous, or unintelligent buffoons. Tanner's reasons for moving to Paris included professional aspirations, the desire to study under the great French artists of the time and to exhibit at the French Salon, but also, it seems, a desire to be free from the racism and oppression and lack of acceptance suffered by African Americans in the United States. As he put it in his autobiography, among other traumas, he'd been subject to a series of what he called disagreeable incidents as the only black student at the art school that he studied at in Philadelphia. I was made to feel that I was not wanted, although in a place where I had every right to be, he wrote. I find it interesting that Tanner painted on at least 16 different occasions works that he called Flight to Egypt, or Flight into Egypt, depicting Joseph, Mary, and a young Jesus fleeing their homeland and seeking refuge in Egypt to escape persecution from King Herod. I wouldn't be surprised if repeated depiction of this scene in Tanner's painting reflected his own desire to flee oppression and injustice, to pursue a resolution to dissonance and chaos, and to seek refuge and safety elsewhere in the world. Perhaps this was a central motif in Tanner's life that he expressed through his art. So we've been hearing and feeling dissonance in jazz, but jazz shouldn't be reduced to dissonance. Dissonance cries out for resolution. Dissonance feels dissonant precisely because it is unresolved. So dissonance has direction. We feel it not as a static feeling or a sense of finality, but as something that demands something else. So inherent to dissonance is an urge or a longing for resolution. So a key motif of jazz then is often a constant movement between dissonance and resolution, tension and release. A dissonance and a tension gets built up, sometimes with a single chord or a brief rhythmic anticipation, but sometimes across many bars of notes or even over several minutes. And as it builds, the listener feels the tension tighten and the dissonance increase until it is perhaps sometimes resolved. Maybe it gets resolved precisely as your ears want it to, perhaps with a big old tonic chord on the downbeat, on beat 1. Or maybe it gets resolved in ways that signals not an ending, but rather a heading in a new direction. Or maybe it doesn't get resolved. Maybe it's left unresolved and your ear is left unsatisfied in the sense that there's no release to the tension, but somehow satisfied nevertheless in the sense that it has heard something truly honest. I think this move from dissonance to resolution is something that we feel politically too, and it's expressed in different ways. So historically, we can think of British and American efforts to humanise slavery. As the institution of slavery came under moral challenge in the 18th and 19th centuries, various actors, some pro-slavery, some anti-slavery, sought to relieve the growing tension, to resolve the apparent dissonance, not only by constructing a notion of the resilient slave, but by efforts to ameliorate the suffering of slaves, by regulating the trade and the treatment of slaves, but while leaving the institution of slavery entirely intact. Perhaps you might sense that there's something troubling about that. The tension is released in some sense, but it's quite a sickly, saccharine release. I think we've felt a similarly sickly, saccharine resolution to the treatment of refugees in recent years too. A saccharine resolution that is perhaps reminiscent of a Disney chord progression, those chord progressions you hear in Disney cartoon movies, in which we feel satiated by a sugary, positive outcome for a central character while forgetting the ongoing vulnerability and suffering of so many others and the unjust structures that are left in place that promise to produce the vulnerability and suffering of many more to come. Think, for example, of, I think, the genuinely wonderful feeling of resolution that many Australians felt in 2022 when the so-called Biolia family, a Sri Lankan couple with 2 little girls who were seeking asylum in Australia, were finally granted permanent visas after years of detention on Christmas Island and elsewhere, and after various public appeals and campaigns that they be released and allowed to stay. There's, of course, something to be celebrated here, but there's also a risk that this resolution to the troubled plight of one prominent refugee family is a syrupy, saccharine sort of resolution that eases our own discomforts, allows us to feel good about ourselves and about our national community, at least for a moment, while the global numbers of refugees continue to climb, and while we continue to turn away so many other asylum seekers who need home and safety, many of whom have been displaced by unjust wars that we have waged in Iraq and elsewhere, or by conflicts fueled by weapons that we have manufactured and sold, or by violence and instability produced by climate breakdown to which we have and continue to unapologetically contribute. This is a sugary but sickly resolution, and I think it helps to name it and feel it as such. So how else might our dissonance be addressed? I'm not ready to provide a full answer to that question, but I think it's worth sitting with and hearing the answers offered in music by slavery's descendants. So one answer is to simply refuse to be bound by dissonance or by tension, to choose to be free and to feel good, regardless of the subjugation and domination that others may continue to wield. So this answer is found in much soul and funk music, a determination to repeatedly constantly release tension, to resolve unambiguously on the tonic, on the downbeat, on the one. So the music of James Brown, for example. So this response to dissonance is pretty joyous. It can be useful, at times it might even be necessary. And it's a response worth cherishing. There's an alternative response though, which is sometimes expressed by descendants of slavery in slave songs and spirituals, in gospel music, the blues and jazz. And that is to look the dissonance in the face and to work and hope that it may be justly overcome. It's an answer to dissonance that's rooted in solidarity and resistance and in hope. Hope for, as Martin Luther King put it, quoting from Scripture, a day when justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So we're going to finish by playing such a song by Duke Ellington called Come Sunday.